Good morning. We're going to get started. My name's Richard Williams. I'm the Director for Policy Research at the Mercatus Center. First of all, let me welcome you to the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. For over 25 years, we've sought to bridge the gap between academic scholarship and real-world problems. In particular, our regulatory studies program has been providing expertise on both individual regulations and the regulatory process to decision makers for over 2 decades. Our conference today is entitled Regulation in the 21st Century Economy, and we feature a distinguished list of experts who represent many decades of regulatory knowledge and experience. Now, for those of you who are new to the Mercatus Center, we're just across the river in Arlington, and we are home to Virginia's largest university, and I want to add, the nation's hottest basketball team, for those of you who are fans. At Mercatus Center, economics is our lens that we look at the world. We have a fundamental belief that public policy can be improved if decisions are examined using the framework of economics. For those of you that may not particularly think this way, we sort of believe that economics permeates everything that we do and every issue. And so most of you are familiar with using economics for things like budgets, taxation, and monetary policy, but we also think that it should play a role in all regulations. One thing it can do is it can ensure that our regulations are effective and that we make the best choice for the costs that we're going to incur. Recently, President Obama said, "Sometimes our rules have gotten out of balance, placing unreasonable burdens on business, burdens that have stifled innovation and have had a chilling effect on growth and jobs." This is an important message for the President to convey to the American public, many of whom are not really attuned to regulations. His new executive order is a welcome focus on the institutional checks and balances that are necessary for us to create effective regulations. However, it is precisely our existing checks and balances that have brought us to the point that the President is concerned about. So there are 3 main points that I want to focus on today. First, regulation is now a big business. Calvin Coolidge once famously said, "The business of America is business." But today, we're at the point where the business of America may be government. By one count, nearly 20% of all Americans are employed by government, state, local, and federal. But that doesn't even count those that are employed complying with regulations. That may take up an additional as much as 14% of the U.S. economy. And we're producing regulations at a fantastic rate. Each year, the Federal Register publishes nearly 80,000 pages announcing new regulations. That's the equivalent of about 400 novels. These regulations are produced by big agencies in concert with the most powerful interests in the country, who lobby for regulations that are favorable to them. At some point, we are in the danger of becoming an overregulated and uncompetitive country. Our question today is, can we alter this course? Second, we're largely regulating in the dark. The quality of our analysis that we use to analyze the impacts of regulations is unknown. Like every decision, all regulations have both benefits and costs. The problem is we don't know what they are. In many cases, we don't even know what problem we're trying to solve or whether we've come close to finding the best way to solve it. Finally, as I said at the outset, our institutions have brought us to this point, and only a change in our institutions will get us different outcomes. Our goal ought to be fewer, more targeted, and more effective regulations that solve real problems. To get those kinds of regulations, I believe there are 2 kinds of institutions that we need to address, particularly that will give us the checks and balances that we need. The first is what Ben Franklin called a moral or prudential algebra. Today, we call that benefit-cost analysis. The second is stakeholder comments. Stakeholder comments should provide an effective check on regulations because quite often they're at odds with what regulatory agencies want to do. But both of these regulatory institutions are in need of repair. Now, a lot of people claim that today we have a very modern approach to regulations. But in reality, we've been doing regulations for a long time, actually since 1887. That's the year that we established the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroads. Let me point out that that was the year that the Stanley expedition reached the Congo. And Stanley said, "Dr. Livingston, I presume." That was also the decade that Wyatt Earp fought it out with the Clintons at the OK Corral in Tombstone, which was then a territory of the territory of Arizona. So we've been at this for a long time. Since then, we filled up 226 books of rules. That's not things explaining rules, that's actual rules that account for 163,000 pages. If you read for 8 hours a day, it would take you up to 4 years to read all of our regulatory rules. And that's not talking about comprehending them, that's just reading them. Okay, so, thank you. So today we're going to provide some speakers to you who bring deep knowledge and experience about both the problems and some long-term solutions. This is not about the regulations of the day. Our intention is to keep America productive and competitive for both this and future generations. I want to start today by announcing to you, unfortunately, Jim Miller has been taken ill and will not be our lunchtime speaker today. However, he will be ably represented by Dr. Bruce Yandel, who will give us an entertaining speech during lunch. And during lunch, I'll point out to you that you have note cards on your table, so if you have questions for Dr. Yandel or any of the other speakers, you'll have a chance to ask them then. We are still awaiting Senator Warner, who has been stuck in traffic. For those of you that live in Washington, this is no surprise. Took me 45 minutes to go across town last night. However, so we'll start the panel, and then we'll bring Dr. Warner up. Excuse me, Senator Warner up. Okay, so if I can ask our first panel to come up here. Let me introduce the panel. First will be Professor Bruce Yandel, and he's going to talk about how regulations play an integral part in economic life, rewarding those inside the government circle of influence, while the rest of us pay the costs. Bruce Yandel is a distinguished adjunct professor of economics at the Mercatus Center. He's the Dean Emeritus of Clemson College of Business and Behavioral Sciences. He was the executive director of the Federal Trade Commission, and he served on the President's Council on Wage and Price Stability. It goes by the lovely name of CALPS, and you'll hear a little more about that at lunch. He has authored or edited 14 books and countless articles. Next will be Dr. Jerry Ellig, who will discuss the Mercatus Report Card, and that's a new project of Mercatus that's looking at the quality and use of regulatory impact analyses. Jerry Ellig is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. He is the former deputy director and acting director of the Office of Policy Planning at the Federal Trade Commission, and he is widely published in regulation. Finally, we have the Honorable Ron Cass, and he will discuss briefly how we've opened up the regulatory process, particularly over the last 65 years since the Administrative Procedures Act was created, so that all citizens have access and can participate, but some preferences get weighed much more heavily than others. Ron Cass is the president of Cass & Associates. He is the Dean Emeritus of Boston University, the Boston University School of Law. He's the former vice chairman of the U.S. International Trade Commission and the author of more than 100 books and articles. So quite a distinguished group we have here today. So what we're going to do is we're going to start now, and when Senator Warner gets here, if it's okay with you gentlemen, we'll stop and let Senator Warner speak. So I would like to now turn it over to my friend, Bruce Yandel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm pleased to be included in this panel today and delighted to be a part of the conference. But I want to discuss some characteristics of what I call America's regulatory era, and in doing so, connect to Mr. Obama's new regulatory review executive order and what its effect might be on the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. The era I address began in 1970. It was then that regulation became highly centralized at the federal level, that newly formed social regulators, such as EPA, joined the older economic regulators, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, to form a new legal environment that ultimately transformed the U.S. from being a code law country, a common law country, to a code law country. The regulatory era formed a new kind of capitalism, what some refer to as regulatory capitalism, and others call state capitalism, where survival and success depend on building fruitful regulatory relationships. Now 40 years and 2.5 million Federal Register pages later, We pause to catch our breath, survey the horizon, and ask if we as a nation can do regulation better. My brief comments include three elements. First, I will talk about the regulatory commons, the resource base on which regulation is produced. Then I will offer some thoughts on how regulation has altered the political economy of the nation. And finally, I will offer a few thoughts that might be considered in conjunction with the new executive order. Inspired by statutes directing action, our multiple regulatory agencies are like sheep with legislative guiding shepherds grazing on a regulatory commons. Fed by growing budgets and expanding duties, the regulators write many rules, and while budgets and congressional directives partially constrain the commons, there's always room for one more bite by the sheep, one more regulation. The regulatory commons parallels its brother, the fiscal commons. Deficits are the inevitable tendency on one, excessive regulation, the tendency on the other. In fact, across the years 1970 through 2009, regulatory agency budgets were fed by deficit dollars. They grew at an annual rate of 5.2% in real terms, while the federal revenue grew at 3% in real terms. What's it like on the regulatory commons? When one puts on a pair of externality-enabling glasses, so that one can see problems more clearly in the economy, one sees endless opportunities to internalize external costs, to solve problems, and maybe even render the world a better place. Whether it be dealing with lead paint scrapings, mandatory inspection of catfish, energy efficiency for refrigerators and furnaces, minimum standards for driver's licenses, diesel engine emissions, advertising over-the-counter drugs, marketing practices of funeral homes, or ridding the market of a noisy hickory-dickory dot-pounding toy. The world is full of unhappy and dangerous situations that need fixing. But with externality glasses, it is much easier to see the flaws than to determine if all people taken together are made better off after the repairs are in place. And who has time to check? As a result, in the post-1970 period, regulations affecting processes, product design, marketing, personnel, finance, manufacturing, began to affect each and every sector of the economy. In a chaotic sense, industries such as autos, food, steel, construction, paper, chemicals, banking were transformed into a kind of public utility, but without the usual regulatory commission to look after them and to capture. On rare occasions over the last 40 years, government analysts made a back-breaking overall industry assessment to describe and analyze the cumulative effects of all federal regulations on a single industry. But most of the time, no one was keeping score. And even more rarely, regulators would conduct retrospective analyses to determine if indeed the regulations that appeared to be so strongly net beneficial at the time they were imposed really turned out that way. And as all of us who have been a part of the regulatory establishment, I was at the Federal Trade Commission, as all of us understand, there is seldom enough agency time to deal with business in the pipeline, let alone engage in the luxury of self-examination. All of the incentives go the other way. The next Federal Register press run is waiting. In a way, the nature of our work as regulators made it far more important to turn out more rules than to inquire about outcomes. Sadly, it's as if no one really cares about outcomes. What we care about are more rules and more paper. That's the product of the regulatory establishment. Recognition of the incentives on the unrationed commons led to institutional inventions like various executive orders. They evolved in a way to establish a gatekeeper and a watchman and required various reviews by executive branch agencies, and sometimes OMB would put pressure on the independent agencies to follow suit. And today we recognize this new executive order, which again is highlighting the important business of looking before we leap. But as this process has continued over these many years, and as we have looked at various kinds of benefit cost analyses and efforts to rein in the process, the economy that we are watching has changed. Years ago, when regulation was young, before we had published those 2.5 million pages of rules, and when we were a lot younger, economists spoke knowingly in tones of certainty about market failure and the need to intervene because of difficulties generated by such things as market power, information asymmetry, failed institutions, unspecified property rights. We talked as though government and regulation were outside the market process, exogenous. And on occasions, regulators would open a window, examine features of the economy, make some efficiency-enhancing adjustments, and then quickly close the window to let the economy operate in a more glorious way. Indeed, we used the word intervention, and we referred sometime to Michael Lance's 1937 Federal Trade Commission statuary metaphor, where a powerful free market horse is being bridled by a benevolent plowman who presumably serves the public interest. But as regulatory windows opened and closed daily, and as agencies pumped out more rules, firms and industries then became intertwined with government. Government was no longer exogenous or outside the market. It was in the marketplace. Government was endogenous. The strong horses and the special interests came seeking the plowman. And while major regulations may have reduced some perceived market failures, they also cartelized industries and reduced competition. And so as we think about how this political economy has changed, words that we might use to describe and explain what we're doing become obsolete. When banks become tantamount to regulated public utilities with rules at every margin, can we accurately refer to a problem as evidence of market failure? Might we more accurately say government failure or regulatory failure? Well, today we have an intertwined political economy where economic agents, public and private, always connected, interact on the commons. Cutting through the entanglement will be difficult. Each rule worth revising or repealing maintains wealth for members of a regulatory cartel. The horses will turn on the plowman. And so while it is critically important that the executive order call for continued benefit cost analysis, I want to suggest that we need to go include that and go beyond it. To encourage competitiveness, going beyond the traditional benefit cost approach, I suggest first agencies do a potential cartel analysis of every major industrial rule, that they be required to identify winners and losers and account for the gains and losses across industries that may result in a rule-induced cartel. Second, that the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission be engaged in the review of major rules in cooperation with OIRA for an antitrust assessment, and that they act as interveners in regulatory proceedings. Third, in conjunction with the new requirement for retrospective analyses and industry reviews, that Congress annually hold hearings for the purpose of reviewing the related reports with an eye toward improving the competitiveness of the U.S. economy and identifying annually the economic gains obtained through OIRA's regulatory review process. 2.5 million pages of rules later, it is time to sharply revise the way we regulate. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Bruce. I think Richard did a heck of a job framing this panel, and I suppose that makes us the drywall guys. Try not to be too dry, though. Well, we have a new executive order on regulation that reaffirms the existing executive order on regulation, directing federal agencies to ask various questions and find various answers before they go ahead and regulate. And here to discuss, here to discuss that is Senator Warner.
You're a good man.
Senator Warner has joined us, so let me introduce him as he makes his way up here. He represents Mason's home state of Virginia, and he was elected to the Senate in 2008, before which he had served as the governor of Virginia between 2002 and 2006. He's also a former co-founder of Nextel, I understand, and he's known to tell people to leave their phones on, but actually for his talks, we would like you to make sure that you get your phones silenced. Senator Warner serves on multiple committees in the Senate, including the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, the Committee on Budget, the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and the Joint Economic Committee. So without saying any further, Senator Warner, thank you for coming. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. I apologize on the front end for being late. But first of all, let me ask, how many of y'all live in Virginia? Wasn't it an extra bad commute this morning? Did you read about the sinkhole on Edsel Street that ended up making the Parkway traffic worse than ever? So I apologize, but hopefully a little bit of understanding in terms of the delay. I like to, in normal crowds, particularly folks that are not from Virginia, go through a quick litany as the former governor of Virginia, all the designations of best managed state and best state for business and all these other things we won. The one thing I don't cite is that we fixed Virginia's transportation problems while I was in that job. But it is a real joy to be here, and also to commend once again the Mercatus Center and all the good work at George Mason on this very, very important topic in terms of regulations in the 21st century. I hope, and I've got great formal remarks here that I'm going to kind of try to speed through so we can get to a point of question and answers. But I hope, as most of the current focus right now is on the questions of CRs and budget resolutions and what we're going to do to kind of keep the government running over this the balance of the fiscal year. One of the areas that I have been spending much more of my time, and it ties at least indirectly into this question about regulations in the 21st century, which is, I hope in our desire to get through the balance of the fiscal year, we don't also miss the opportunity to recognize that there may be a moment in time here to look at our overall deficit and debt on a much broader basis. And I don't want to overly predict here, but I think there is a real growing recognition from members in both parties, at least in the Senate, that if we continue to focus the debate on the 12% of non-defense domestic discretionary spending, we're never going to get out of there. And that importance in terms of the long-term future of our country is to make sure that we get that deficit and debt under control, and that it's going to require putting everything on the table. It's going to require tax reform policy, it's going to require entitlements, it's going to require defense. And it's critically important in terms of getting our balance sheet in place, but it's also critically important if we're going to continue to grow our economy and stay competitive in a global sense. And that ties directly into the subject of today's sessions. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, regulations directly affect the competitiveness of America vis-a-vis the other nations in the world. And thinking about competitiveness from a multi-pronged front, from the fact that we've got to grow our economy, we've got to get our balance sheet in order, and regulations tie into that competitiveness strategy. Too often we think about competitiveness in terms of simply what we can do in terms of innovation, what we can do in terms of flow of capital, what we can do in terms of public and private sector investment. But more and more often in a 21st century economy, regulations play a critical role in terms of evaluating America's competitiveness. And frankly, if we are looking at recent international rankings, when you see one of the things that kind of should be more shocking and I don't think a lot of my colleagues on either side of the aisle fully recognize, is that America has fallen from 4th to 5th in terms of international competitiveness rankings, and remarkably, the country that passed us was the UK. The UK, and I look around this room, there are some folks in there here that are my age. I kind of grew up with the idea that old England was the epitome of bureaucracy and regulations, where in a sense that one of the reasons that the UK has passed the United States in terms of international competitiveness is that both under the Labour government and under the Conservative government, regulatory reform has been a focus for the last 4 or 5 years. Something that has not really been, I think, of enough focus here in this country. Now, the challenge is going to be, how do we, whether it's deficit, whether it's competitiveness, or whether it's regulation, and we may have some spirited discussion on this, find some middle ground. We've got these kind of caricatures of the partisan positions, which are, Democrats have never seen an economic activity anywhere that wouldn't be helped by a little more regulation. And my Republican colleagues with the kind of a folk that regulations per se are evil and consequently need to be eliminated. I think that's kind of simplistic approach on both sides is not where we're going to find not just common ground, but appropriate ground to move forward. I was involved very involved last year in a piece of legislation that I'm sure has caused some consternation in this room, and the Dodd-Frank bill, financial reform. We have many times after the fact focused on in certain areas where there was excessive regulation, and let me acknowledge there were parts of Dodd-Frank that put in place way too much regulation, although I'm quick to remind some of my colleagues in the financial industry that some of that regulation was because the financial industry itself came and begged us in Congress, please don't you guys decide, give it to the regulators. But there was also, I think at times, a failure to acknowledge that, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there were clearly areas in terms of a level of financial products that had been created, that had been sold to the American public and the world public, that this was about lowering the price of risk, when in reality they created a financial house of cards, and not having some level of appropriate oversight for some of those financial products was not something, at least at the beginning of the debate, that anybody would have disagreed with. So some level of appropriate regulation, but that realizes it has to be put in the frame of overall world competitiveness, has to be a greater focus of policymaking. Let me come back also as I kind of get into the meat of what I want to talk about. Another marker that came down this week that I think again ties into our subject, and that was the GAO report that talked about policy overlap. I salute Senator Coburn for pushing this report. This is an area that I focused on as governor. This is an area where we've had there was a little piece of legislation we got through last year that I actually think could be the littlest, most important new law that nobody's ever heard of, and that was the GIPRA bill that in terms of government performance and metrics. And the reason I raise it now was, as you may have seen from the GAO report, it pointed out 82 separate programs where there was enormous overlap. I think there were 82 separate programs, for example, alone on teacher evaluation. I remember as a governor the enormous amount of federal government overlap in terms of workforce training, area after area where we can find through consolidation financial savings, stretching the taxpayer dollar, and I would argue are ripe for areas when you have dramatic program overlap, you've also got dramatic regulatory overlap. If you've got 17 different programs dealing with food safety, each of those programs setting forth their own set of regulatory burdens, this is going to add to excessive regulation and is going to compound the problem in terms of both inefficient allocation of government resources, but also inefficiencies in terms of how private business has to compete. So program overlap and regulatory overlap is an area that I don't think has received enough attention, and the GAO report should give us some guidance there. I mentioned the GIPRA bill only because one of the pieces of that legislation required, for the first time ever, and well, this is the point that didn't get a lot of attention, that every agency has to identify not only their top performing programs, but actually their least performing programs. If we're ever going to get towards program elimination, program consolidation, to simply leave that with OMB or outsiders without actually trying to engage the agencies themselves in that evaluation, that combined with the GAO study could be, I think, a very valuable and important tool going forward. Now, to the kind of the meat, regulatory review. One of the things that has struck me, and I preface this again, as I was mentioned in the outset, I was co-founder of Nextel. I was a venture capitalist for 20 plus years. I still lay the claim I was much longer a business guy than I've been an elected official, which I think hopefully keeps me with the right perspective. But one of the things that I think that we, and I understand that one of the previous speakers already may have keyed this up, part of our regulatory review process has to be, how do we get the incentives right? How do we get the incentives right, not only from a policy-making standpoint, but how do we get the incentives right inside an agency with regulatory rulemaking responsibility? Right now, there is no incentive for an agency to ever eliminate or consolidate regulations. If anything, we have perverse incentives in place that actually say to an agency, if you make more regulations, if you add more challenges, you are at least indirectly rewarded with more public dollars, more attention, and more focus. And that, if we're trying to say we need a balance, and that if we're trying to say we need to try to get this right in terms of balancing the overall public goals and still remain competitive, the incentives aren't there and they aren't appropriately aligned. As well as the fact that while we have had momentarily blips over the last 20 years from both Democrats and Republicans alike, but those blips have never had real legs, where has there been ever any real process to go back and clean up those regulations that have outlived their purpose, technology is bypassed, or the business practices have dramatically changed? One of the things we see in world-class companies today is the management technique, whether it's the Six Sigma or the whole notion of continuing process improvements. Could you think about, again, I'm from the technology business, but as we've seen kind of the evolution, IBM to Microsoft to Google to now Facebook, and then IBM kind of jump-starting again and coming back into the pack, if any business stayed in a kind of static position on their business processes or internal rules, they would be out of business. And the corporate world is replete with examples of great companies that couldn't keep pace. Well, in a sense, that is what we do in government. We are additive. We never go back and look at clearing out the underbrush, getting rid of rules and regulations that don't make sense, and trying to reposition ourselves. So how do we get about changing that? And let me give my 2 seconds review on some of the other proposals out there. With apologies to advocates of particular ones, you'll have a chance to whack me on mine in a moment, but kind of how I see the landscape. One is there is a sense from some that, let's just go out and go for a moratorium. And particularly from some at this point, vis-a-vis the EPA or agencies that perhaps have gotten a little too vibrant these days. How is that for a politically correct term in this crowd in the age of YouTube? You know, what you say can and will be used against you. You know, moratorium has a great political appeal. It's simple. It's easy. Also, I think makes no sense to kind of objectively draw a bright line and say for a period of time we're going to stop regardless of scientific advancement, stop regardless of what has happened in the world in terms of accident or event, Gulf oil spill being prime, or because we're suddenly finding that the market or others have gotten way ahead of any of us in terms of understanding. Moratorium, I think, does not make sense, even though it's politically, I think, very attractive. I've also had a chance to spend some time looking at Senator DeMint and Representative Davis's approach in terms of the REINS Act. I think it has more appeal, but in terms of putting a congressional check on the process and kind of forcing that review, but and I say this as a relatively new member of Congress, only been in for 2 years, I'm not sure bringing Congress fully into the process speeds up anything. And the notion that if we're trying to give, particularly for industry, predictability, it may lead to more delay, but I'm not sure a thorough, full-fledged congressional approval process on every major regulation gets us to where we need to be in terms of economic predictability and really a much more rational process. I'm more intrigued with Representative Young's approach on independent data and sunsets. The sunset approach has been used at times in the past. It's kind of ebbs and flows in terms of sunsets on regulations, sunsets on laws. To my knowledge, and again, there's more knowledge in this room on this subject, there's a lot of efforts around sunsetting laws and regulations. They never seem to have really played out that well. I do think there is a sense of, though, and this is part of the REINS Act and part of Congressman Young's approach, which is the idea of at least giving Congress, while not a full check, some independent data and some independent kind of baseline approach to kind of beyond OIRA, how do we kind of figure out what the cost and benefits of certain regulations are, is an important tool. So let me get to where I'm coming from. When we started thinking about this, and Susan and others, there's a series of folks I want to thank who've been helping us think this through, has said, how do we accomplish, what are our goals? One is, a goal was to try to get those incentives aligned correctly. How do we make sure that an agency that is tasked with a public purpose, whether it's protecting the public or evaluating safety or efficacy, thinks about that public purpose in a way that has to make some cost-benefit analysis and has an incentive to say, how do we accomplish the goal? But if we can get 97% of the goal for 50% of the cost, they'll think about that seriously as opposed to getting 99% with 130% of the cost. So incentive alignment was one goal. Secondly, how do we get a goal? How do we get a broad stated policy goal that would actually put a process in place that would effectively go about trying to clean out some of the regulations that have been put in place in the past that have either outlived their usefulness, that have, that technology is transformed by, or even if the industry is accepted as kind of common practice, that may, in a greater scheme, be useful for elimination or consolidation. So, and also, how do we do something that at least at a conceptual level doesn't immediately, that has some appeal beyond a Mercatus regulation policy crowd? How do we get this in a way that my fellow policymakers can understand and translate and not have their eyes glaze over in 30 seconds? So what we worked on was a concept. It was pretty simple. Regulatory pay-go. If you, in a particular regulatory area, an agency is tasked with adding a new regulation, that agency has to make the evaluation and cost-benefit analysis, and at the same time, because you're in effect setting a regulatory baseline, you're not doing a full regulatory budget, but if you're adding a regulation, you have to take one away. Now, simple concept. The pay-go concept is obviously very familiar on Capitol Hill, even if it has a few holes in it at this point. But we thought, could we push forward on this area? We thought as well that if we were moving forward on this area, to try this for a 3 or 5 year period would be something of, might have some broader bipartisan appeal, in the sense that it would, for that 3 to 5 year period, really become effective at clearing out some of the underbrush in the past. As well, by moving forward with this process, it would require a much greater kind of cost-benefit analysis, because you'd have to set a baseline. There are clearly some challenges in this, whereby, if you take one away in an area, it has to be relatively within the same scope. You can't add a new environmental regulation and take away a regulation in food safety, and you can't, this can be carried to the extreme that says, you can't have a process that would say, okay, we're going to add a new regulation on salmonella and take one away on mad cow disease. You have to have some level of congressional check on an expedited process at the end of the year that would kind of bless this, so you don't have the agencies running amok. But before anyone in the crowd, and again, this is a group that is probably familiar with this, says, well, this is just too hard to do and can't be done, let me go back to my example of where we stand on competitiveness. The UK has actually implemented regulatory pay-go. Now, they call it the one in, one out approach, and by no means is have they completely solved it. But what they have found so far, and I've had some conversations with our friends in the UK, is that what they have done is they have found that agencies that have put forward regulations, if they originally came forward with a regulation that was going to cost an industry 150 million pounds, and the agency has then found that they've got to take something away of 150 pounds worth of value, they found time and again that at the end of the day they can end up with a regulation that still accomplishes that public purpose, but it gets wheedled back to suddenly where it might be a 20 or 30 million pound cost benefit. And it may not be to the perfection of some of the advocates on the regulatory side, but it ends up accomplishing the purpose in a way that makes the UK more competitive. And I close with that fact again. The proof's in the pudding. Independent validation puts the UK ahead of us in terms of international competitiveness. That is something that has to be kind of our overarching goal in regulatory review and regulations in the 21st century forum. This is an idea, regulatory pay-go, that I hope will get some support and pushback from this crowd and others. We are working through kind of the second and third layer of detail on this, and I think it should be part of the debate, and I'm looking forward to working with my friends at Mercatus and others in this area to try to get it right. So with that, I'm happy to have been here. I know I've gone beyond my time, and I know we've got a congressman coming afterwards, but I'd be more than happy to take a couple questions.
One question, and there's Dan Claybaugh's back there, so if you just raise your hand, he'll bring you a microphone. Dan, this one's terrific.
Well, I've got kind of a loud voice.
Okay. Well, we'd like to get you on tape, though, so. You just tell us who you are and ask your question briefly.
Hi, Senator. My name is Brett McMahon. I'm actually a local concrete contractor, but I'm deeply interested in this kind of thing. In the District of Columbia, there is a financial control board in waiting. Essentially, once they pass a certain threshold, a financial control board goes into effect. I preface this question in that way by saying, is it actually reasonable to expect that agencies will be able to self-regulate in terms of their output and things like that, if in fact those agencies are, in essence, eternal? In other words, the incentive for them to actually become so onerous on the economy doesn't really affect them because the agency itself is not going away. Maybe their output decreases, but unless there's actually a way to say, you know what, you've actually, as an agency, outlived your usefulness, or we need to replace you with something like this DC Financial Control Board in waiting. Unless that exists, how can you possibly incentivize an agency to stop output?
A couple of thoughts on that. One is the premise there, I think, is that the agency's purpose and usefulness has kind of outlived its time. I think you're right that no agency is going to immediately say, okay, we're done, stick a fork in us. I've not at least ever seen that happen so far in government. But I'm not sure. I need to think through, and if the Financial Control Board in waiting doesn't eliminate the agency, it just says if you kind of overdo, you're going to have another regulatory body take place, at least my understanding is. I still think that is ultimately the responsibility kind of the executive or the legislative branch, and the president has put in place this idea that we're going to look at consolidation, we're going to look at regulatory review, although I think we need some more teeth. That's why I'm trying to get this balance right. So I think that should ultimately still be the legislators or the executive's responsibility, number one. Number two, I will emphasize, one of the things I tried to do last year, didn't get a lot of attention, was said, well, and I've done this as governor, actually eliminate programs. It's not just agencies. Tell me what every politician likes to come and be at the ribbon cutting or the photo op when you announce a new program that's going to solve some problem. When was the last time you ever had a politician show up when we said we're actually going to close the doors of a particular program? It doesn't happen. And I took last year, tried to take at least the lowest hanging fruit. I took those programs that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration ought to have agreed on an elimination. There were only 16 of them, 17 of them. There was only $1 billion, but $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Who's talking about money, and we kind of couldn't get there. I do think there may be a moment in time right now as the issues around the deficit come up, this GAO study, the GIP report portion last year, where we could see at least program elimination. On regulatory elimination, I don't know how we get there agency alone. I think it's the legislator's responsibility, but I do think you will. Our PAYGO approach says you at least put a check. If you're adding something, that you got to take something away, you will at least have the agency as a participant thinking, oh my gosh, which ones, if we got to really add something, which ones really have outlived its usefulness, and they will be at least incentive to try to find and help clear us out some of the regulations that have outlived their usefulness. Getting them in the game is what I'm trying to do. A lot of the other things, whether you leave it with Congress or moratorium or a simple sunset provision, I think the agencies have to be kind of in the mix on their incentives. Not a perfect solution, but it's.
Thanks, Senator Warner.
Thank you all very much.
While I'm introducing Representative Jim Jordan, those of you who need a seat, there are a lot of seats up here in the front. I promise not to call on you. Okay, so let me now introduce Congressman Jim Jordan. He represents Ohio's 4th District. And growing up in Ohio, Congressman Jordan prepared for his future in Congress by winning an impressive 4 state championships in wrestling. and he had a career record of 150 wins and 1 loss. He was first elected to Congress in 2006 after serving in the Ohio legislature between 1995 and 2006. Congressman Jordan serves on the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, where he is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Regulatory Affairs, Stimulus Oversight, and Government Spending. He also serves on the Committee on the Judiciary, where he's a member of both the Subcommittee on the Constitution and the Subcommittee on Intellectual Property, Competition, and the Internet. So, Congressman Jordan, thank you.
Thank you. I tell folks, don't clap. You haven't heard me talk yet. Plus 2 politicians back to back, your brave souls. It's good to be with you. I will first thank the Mercatus and the great work that you all do, and the world we live in today, understanding that if you're going to get economic growth, you got to have reasonable tax policy and not ridiculous regulatory policy. So we appreciate the work. Let me just make a couple comments and take your questions. And I apologize. We're having a markup that started 5 minutes ago that I'm supposed to be at in Judiciary Committee, so I do want to get to that. Let me do the good news, bad news. Good news is never forget this. In spite of all the problems we face, I tell every group this today because I think it's important. Greatest country in history. Never forget that fact. I had the opportunity 6 weeks ago to be at the Reagan Library, and when you go out, they had this new exhibit, and you literally walk through each room. In each room, you got emotional because you thought about what the country had to do. We forget how bad it was. And what we had to deal with in 1980, 81, when President Reagan took office, they had this one room. It was interesting. Think foreign policy. The Iron Curtain and the Communist Bloc, Eastern Bloc countries. They had all the bad guys' pictures on the wall. They had Ortega and some of the Eastern Bloc, and of course they had Gaddafi, who's still a bad guy. His picture was on the wall too. It was just interesting. The things Reagan had to overcome economically with interest rates and everything. So I tell every group I understand how difficult it is right now in the country, but we've been through tough times before, and we've risen to the occasion every single time, 200-plus years, and we will be able to do it again. And frankly, the optimism that Reagan had is critical when you think about what we face. Because as the speaker said, and as frankly as I've been saying, the country is broke. We can't keep doing the same old, and we have to cut spending. You guys all know the numbers. Our debt to GDP ratio, deficit to GDP ratio, you start looking at where they're at, and they're comparable to the countries we've read about the last year and a half on the front page. And we've got to change. But you can't get there alone just by cutting spending. I mean, we have to do that. We have to get our fiscal house in order. But you have to have economic growth if you're ultimately going to deal with the numbers we're facing. When you got a $14 trillion national debt and going to go over 20 in the next decade, you have to have economic growth to ultimately deal with this. And to have economic growth, you got to have the right framework, and you all understand this. You got to have reasonable tax policy. The one area I think we may be able to agree with the president. There's not much I agree with our president on, but if you remember his State of the Union address, when he talked about lowering corporate tax rates, that's something we have to think about doing. I mean, I would actually make the case that I think it's almost unpatriotic not to be for lowering the corporate tax rate today when you think about what we have to deal with in the international marketplace. And then, of course, we got to have not just reasonable tax policy, but you got to have the right energy policy. And of course, what we're focused on is regulatory policy. You can't have the kind of growth we need to get out of this situation if you don't improve all those areas. There are some good things that I think are being introduced. The REINS Act that Jeff Davis has. Tim Walberg has a bill that he's introduced which says the EPA can't do anything unless Congress gives it specific approval. Obviously, we know that's a concern. There was a telling moment in the Oversight Committee a few weeks ago. We had a hearing on regulatory concerns. And small business owners from around the country were invited in. One happened to be from our district, Jack Busher. Busher Electric from Minster, Ohio. Very successful company. Jack started this 20-some years ago. Leader in his community, like all these small business owners who were in front of the committee are. And I thought the most compelling question was asked by a freshman member. And again, I think this freshman class is really the key to helping us turn this country around, put us on the right path. But this freshman asked the simple question. He said, if you knew then what you know now, would you start it? If you knew then what you know now, would you have started? And pretty appropriate question. And here was the sad fact. Every single witness on that stand said, I would not have started my business. And that because of all the things you have to. I have two buddies who are in manufacturing, been great friends of mine for for years, as I mentioned, my background's in wrestling. These guys are wrestling guys. Boys wrestle with our sons. And successful manufacturers, and I was Bruce and Mike, brothers, and I was talking with them one day. This is a couple years ago, actually. And Mike said to me, and this is just like Mike speaking straight to me, he says, Jim, we love being in business. We hate being employers. And we hate being employers because of the stuff you make us do. Pointed right at me. So I mean, that's what we're up against. And our job on the committee is to look, it's just to bring attention to, we're the oversight committee. Our job is to shine the light of day on the ridiculous things that make it tough for the job creators to create jobs. Those things that are an impediment to economic growth. And that's what we're going to do. Now, think about this. Today is an important day. I think it's great that you're having this conference this day. The 1099 provision is going to get overturned. We're going to vote that. I mean, who would have thought the other party, and you know, I won't get partisan here, but the other party, the health care bill was there. That was it. That's the cat's meow. That's their number one thing. They got that passed, and yet here they are repealing a provision in their signature piece of legislation because the American people said, this makes absolutely no sense. This is stupid. This is ridiculous. Business owners said the same thing. So that's the role of our committee, to draw attention to those things that absolutely make absolutely no sense. We had one other example I'll give you, then as I said, I'll be brief and I'll take any questions you got and get to committee. OSHA and the noise provision they were going to put in place. Have you followed this one? Where they were going to, they were telling manufacturers, it's not good enough that you have ear protection for your employees, but you got to put barricades and barriers up around your machines to stop the noise. I mean, it was millions of dollars this was going to cost manufacturers. And because we raised enough concern about this, they're no longer going to do that. That's what our role is as we move forward. And I think we're going to be successful. I really do. I think we're going to do the right kind of things to create the environment where we can have economic growth and have a resurgence in this country, just like they did back in the 80s with President Reagan. If you get a chance, and I'll stop here, and I know politicians say they'll stop here 5 times, but I mean it. I will stop here. Read the column. Read the column that Tony Blankley wrote December 20th in the Washington Times. A powerful piece. And the title of the column is called The American Miracle. And let me preface it by saying this. In my time in public life, I have never seen the American people more ready, more receptive for the things that need to be done, the tough love things that need to be done to fix the country. The people are ready. Read this column. Blankley's point is this. He says, and he wrote it better than I'll say it, but he said in early 2009, everybody in this country was scared. Everyone was scared. 401ks had lost value. People lost jobs. People lost their homes. General Motors, the greatest corporation in American history, was going bankrupt. Everybody was nervous. Everybody was scared. Well, the market was down. It's the truth. We all were. Along comes a new president, and he promises more big government. Promises what politicians typically promise. You know, bailout, stimulus, all those things that took place. And he said, then the American miracle occurred. And the American people said, we will embrace liberty over the so-called protection of big government. And he makes the point, no other people on the planet would have made that decision. And he calls it the American miracle. I think the American people are ready for the things that have to be done on a regulatory front, on a tax front, and frankly on a spending front to put us back on the right path. The central question is, are the politicians, will we live up to the standard the American people set? And that's our charge. And I happen to have one other responsibility in this Congress, and that's heading the Republican Study Committee, which is this group of conservatives in the Republican Conference. Our mission is real simple, to make sure our party acts like our party, to do what Dick Armey's, to follow Dick Armey's line. Dick Armey said, when we act like us, we win. When we act like them, we lose. Our job is to make sure we act like us. And we take that very seriously as we move forward on this issue and a host of others that I think are important to having a America that's going to be strong forever. So I'll stop there and take your questions. And I apologize, but I do have to run the committee. So you get and remember, even though you're not in the 4th District of Ohio, you still pay my salary, and there's this thing we call the First Amendment. So you're allowed to yell at me. You're allowed to ask any question you want. And I got about 5 minutes, and I got to go.
So let's have questions quickly. Now's your chance.
Look at that. That's never happened. Oh, that I guess. Okay.
Al McGurlin all the way in the back. I'll identify him for you. Al.
Boy, I would have lots of questions, but I guess I'll stick with one. I read the Republican study budget proposals, And I was struck by the fact that it just seemed to me that you were kind of leaving agriculture alone. We had that GAO report that just came out, talked about ethanol and all the duplicity there as well. Do you have any plans on reforming ag policy?
Look, I will tell you from a personal standpoint, yeah, we do need to tackle that. I'm Western Ohio, West Central Ohio, and the start of the Corn Belt. We have pretty big agriculture in our district. I vote against the Farm Bill, and I tell my corn growers, in fact, I'm meeting with them next Tuesday. It'll be an interesting meeting. I tell the corn growers, I'm all for ethanol. I'm just tired of the government subsidizing and protecting it. I mean, think about this. Tell me a product in history that gets what ethanol gets. They get the tariff protection, blender's tax credit, mandated usage, and subsidy to put in the pumps to do the E15, E85. So I don't know in my lifetime. I can't think of another product. Maybe there is one, but every time I ask that question, no one tells me another product that gets 4 protections from government. So you're exactly right. Look, the situation is so bad, everything has to be on the table. You really have to look at it all. And as I said before, you have to have economic growth because we had the most conservative budget. I introduced it last year, the only one that balanced in Congress. Our budget balanced in 9 years, and we were viewed as the radical crazies, you know. You talk to folks back home and they'll go, hey, Jordan, you big sissy, what are you doing taking 9 years? You know, do it like we have to do in our business and our family. We were considered radical in this town, but even ours, which gets to balance in 9 years, in that 9 years, obviously you're still piling on debt because you're still running deficits till you get to balance. So the most conservative budget still gets to like 18 trillion in debt over the next decade. And Obama's plan, if you saw that, what he unveiled a week and a half ago, unbelievable. The lowest he gets is $700 billion deficit, 3% of GDP, which is just, any economist will tell you, you got to be lower than 3%. And he gets there with pretty rosy assumptions on revenue and economic growth. Just doesn't make any sense.
At Casano GE, how would you define the right energy policy and the right regulatory policy?
The right energy policy is to use more of the energy we have to let permitting take place in the Gulf. I've had the opportunity to travel to, and I know sometimes in this town we get tired of hearing this, but we should drill and we should use the resources the good Lord has blessed us with, use them in as safe a way as possible. We're the most environmentally safe country on the planet, but we got to use what we have. And I take it back to the big picture. And I believe this just as sure as I'm standing here. And maybe there are folks on the left who may not think this. The world's a dangerous place. We all understand that. We're seeing it play out in the Mideast right now. But it's a more dangerous place if America's not leading. So it's safer when America leads. You cannot lead militarily, diplomatically, if you're not the big economy. You have to be the strongest economic. You have to be the leading economy in the world if you're going to be the leading military, leading country diplomatically. And you can't be the leading economy in the world if you don't have adequate energy. It is really that basic. So if we want a safer planet, we need to have an energy policy that makes sense. I really believe that. Some on the left would argue with me, but I just think they're flat wrong. So we need to use all the resources that we have. Obviously from Ohio, coal country, we think that's important. We got abundance of coal in this country. We should use it. Nuclear, and we should drill for the oil that we have. I've been to ANWR. I always tell this, and you all know this story, but I probably heard it. We flew over ANWR. I mean, we flew all over the whole darn thing. There's nothing to see. I mean, there's a big mountain and it slopes forever, miles and miles and miles to the sea. I didn't see one caribou. I didn't see one polar bear. But at mile marker 0, pump station number 1, 75 miles from ANWR at the Alaskan pipeline, there are caribou everywhere. I mean, it's amazing. We had it on our website. They're just all over the place. So it's ridiculous that we're not using them. I got time for one more, and I got to run. Anyone? Last chance to yell to Congressman.
Thank you. This is Gary Becker. I'd like for you to consider, in either this talk or in future, the ability of the private sector to create jobs as a return on investment as a goal.
Yeah, well said.
And
well said.
Not one comment that you made today, unfortunately, or Senator Warner made earlier, dealt with anything with regards to jobs.
Yeah.
And I think we all, like myself, many of us are employed here, but many of us outside this room are not.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, no, I guess what I was, maybe I didn't make it clear. To create a framework for economic growth, that's what policymakers' job is, to create the right framework so you can have economic growth. Economic growth is job creation. So We don't create jobs. Politicians don't create jobs. Private sector does. But we create the framework that's conducive to job creation and economic growth. That's what we're all about. And you trust, I mean, you got to have reasonable regulatory policy, you got to have smart energy policy, and you got to have good tax policy if you're going to get there. That's why I mentioned those. Great. Thank you all very much. Keep up the great work.
Okay, well, if we want to talk about regulatory reform, we have to figure out where we are and where we're starting from. And we're starting from a position where federal agencies have been told for decades by presidents via executive order that they must do various types of regulatory analysis, particularly for the really big regulation. And occasionally Congress tells agencies that you must do some type of analysis or you must consider some factor like costs or efficiency. So how well have regulatory agencies been doing the things that presidents and sometimes Congress have been telling them to do for decades? The short answer is overall not that well. The problem is institutional, not political or personal. So don't take my first answer as either a complaint about the people in regulatory agencies or a call for, oh, if we just had a different political party in charge, everything would be fine. And that implies that to improve the quality of regulatory analysis and the regulatory process, what we need fundamentally are institutional reforms that will make sure that good analysis is required, that it's objective, and that it's used. Okay, how did I get to those conclusions? If you try to figure out how well agencies do regulatory analysis today, it turns out there is an existing scholarly literature on this. And typically what researchers have done is either selected several regulations and their impact analysis for a very detailed case study look, or researchers have taken another method where they'll take a subset of certain types of regulations. Often it's been health, safety, environmental regulations, put together a checklist of things that ought to be in the analysis and see whether the agencies did those things. And the results of that literature are not that encouraging. The results, scholars tend to find that on average, regulatory analysis isn't that great. There's wide variation in quality. There are some really good regulatory analyses that have been done over time, but even sometimes pretty elaborate ones have problems in them. Researchers tend to find that quality doesn't vary much from one administration to the next. And that when it comes to actually using the analysis, sometimes agencies will use a regulatory analysis in ways that affects decisions on the margin. And if it's a big regulation, that can be a big effect. But in an awful lot of cases, the agency makes a lot of the decisions it's going to make, then hands the regulation to the economist and says, here, do the regulatory analysis. Now, this is what's in existing literature. A few years ago at the Mercatus Center, Patrick McLaughlin and I asked a question, is this generally true? What if we could look at all of the economically significant regulations for several years and evaluate them according to a common framework and figure out if we include everything, health, safety, environmental, civil rights, budget regulations that implement spending programs, if we evaluate everything, how does it stack up? How do different kinds of regulations to compare? And that was the genesis of the Mercatus Center's, what we now call our regulatory report card. We look at all of the economically significant regulations that have been issued for the past several years. We're looking at these when the regulations are proposed so that hopefully our evaluation of the analysis might be able to have some effect as the regulation is revised and as the regulatory analysis is revised. And we look at two kinds of things. First off, we look at the quality of the analysis. Things like how well does the agency define the outcome that the regulation is supposed to produce and demonstrate that the regulation really will produce that outcome. How well does the regulation define the systemic problem that the regulation is trying to solve? How well does the agency examine a wide variety of alternative ways to solve the problems? What are the costs and what are the benefits of the different alternatives? How well documented is the analysis? How easily could somebody who wanted to replicate it follow the sources and get the data and replicate it? How clear is it? How easy is it even to find it on regulations.gov or otherwise on the internet. Then we also look at the Federal Register notice that proposes the regulation to see to what extent did the regulatory analysis seem to have some sort of effect on the decisions the agency made. At a minimum, we're trying to figure out, did the agency even claim to use the regulatory analysis? We look at, does it look like the regulatory analysis had an effect on the decisions the agency made in the regulation? And did the agency make some type of provision for retrospective analysis of the regulation by establishing some goals and measures and identifying data that could be used to evaluate the quality of the regulation in the future? Well, what are we finding? We found that we've completed evaluating all the economically significant regulations proposed in 2008 and 2009. We're finding the average quality is low. On our scoring criteria, we have 12 criteria, 5 points apiece, with a score between 0 and 5 for each criterion. So maximum possible score is 60 points. The average is about 27 in both 2008 and 2009. There are some good ones, but they're not stellar. The best one we've seen so far earned 48 out of 60 points. And that was the joint regulation proposed by the Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency in 2009 that was the combined corporate average fuel economy and greenhouse gas emission standards for automobiles. We see wide variation in quality. In 2009, I mentioned the best one was 48 points. In 2009, the lowest score was one that earned just 3 points. This was a Department of Energy regulation on loan guarantees for innovative technologies. In 2008, the lowest score a regulation earned was 7 points. This was a Social Security regulation on scheduling administrative law judges. And the fact that both of those regulations are regulations that implement federal spending programs. Sometimes agencies have to issue regulations to implement spending or revenue collection. When they're economically significant, we include them. And I can tell you, we found that in general, the programs that implement budget or spending, the regulations that implement budget or spending programs tend to have much lower quality analysis than other types of regulations. We even see variations within the same department. In 2008, for example, in 2008 there was a different corporate average fuel economy regulation proposed by the Department of Transportation. That scored the highest in 2008, 43 points. But in the same year, Department of Transportation had a regulation on integrity management for gas distribution pipelines that only scored 28 points. Similarly, in that year, one of the top scoring regulations was a Department of Labor regulation that was outlining the circumstances under which the providers of individual retirement plans like IRAs and 401ks could also provide us with investment advice, because you get into some weird conflict of interest issues. The regulations are trying to sort that out. That analysis earned a score of 40 points out of 60. At the same time that year, there was a Labor Department regulation on underground refuges and coal mines, only earned 28 points. By the way, I should emphasize, none of these scores indicate whether the authors of the report card think the regulation is a good idea or a bad idea. We're simply evaluating what's the quality of the analysis and what's the evidence that the agency used it somehow. Use of analysis. Yeah, we did find, looking through, at least for 2008 and 2009, agencies claimed that the analysis affected something that looked like a major decision, maybe about a fifth of the time. So for about 4/5 of the economic regulations, we couldn't really find anything in the Federal Register notice where the agency claimed to use the analysis to make decisions. Again, that suggests that an awful lot of the analyses are done, in some cases very well, by economists who've been handed the regulation after the decisions were already made. Now, there are some bright spots. The best performance we saw on individual criteria we look at were things like accessibility and clarity. That might be telling us that the things that are done the best are the things that are the easiest thing to do. Another bright spot we see is it seems to be the case that when Congress in legislation specifically directs agencies to do analysis or to consider some factor like cost or efficiency, that does get done. So when Congress leads, agencies are certainly more than willing to do stuff. And on every criterion where we evaluate these analyses, it seems like A few of the analyses do reasonably well. Nobody does everything well, though. So the knowledge is there. The knowledge is there to do good regulatory analysis spread across the federal government, but seems like the incentives are somehow awry. And so again, that suggests that we have an institutional problem here, not a political problem. But probably the best evidence of that we've seen is when we compare the scores between 2008 and 2009, obviously two different presidential administrations. We find that the average score is about the same. The distribution of scores is about the same. It's sort of a bell curve, a little fatter on the lower end for both years. And if we look at individual criteria scores, there are very few changes from 2008 to 2009. Again, suggesting the issue is the issue is a question of institutions and incentives, not a question of politics and who are the people in charge. So how do we build on the strengths and fix the weaknesses? Well, I think we need reforms that do three things. Reforms that require regulatory analysis legislatively, not just by executive order, applies to independent agencies as well as the executive branch agencies. Reforms that would make analysis more objective, such as a requirement that agencies have to do regulatory analysis before they publish the proposed regulation and put the analysis out for public comment along with all the data and the other underlying information. And then reforms that will at least require agencies to explain how they used the analysis, if not requiring them to use it in certain ways. Now, of course, institutional reforms are difficult. They're never going to be easy. And so I would leave you then with the inspirational words of that great Eastern philosopher, Yogi Berra. If this was easy, it wouldn't be so hard.
Thanks, Gary. That's good. Thanks.
I want you to notice I went all the way around to my right to get here. I want to thank the Mercatus Center for inviting me. I do have to say, when Richard was describing the panel to us when we had our little pre-call, he said, we're going to start with Bruce, who's going to explain just how bad things are and how scary regulations are. Then we'll go to Jerry, who will tell us how we can measure how bad things are. And then Ron will talk about process. So I'm here to talk about process. I'm going to come at this a little bit sideways. I want to start with a story of a fellow, and you can tell these are all true stories, who was talking to God. And he said, you know, I wanted to get a little perspective here, God. How long is a billion years from your standpoint? And God said, really, it's like a second. And the man said, and how much is $1 billion from your standpoint? And God said, it's like a penny. And the fellow thought for a minute and said, could I have one of your pennies? And God said, sure. Can you wait a second? When we talk about making decisions, it's important to know how we go about making it, what the rules are, what sort of process we use, and what the terms are we're dealing with. If you look at agency regulation, we started out with a fairly simple framework in the Administrative Procedure Act. It was designed by people who were really pragmatic. They were appointed back in the 30s by President Roosevelt after another committee he had appointed came back with recommendations he really didn't like. Congress liked him, passed a bill that he vetoed. But he said, let's see if we can do a little bit better with this, and put a committee together of some of the leading experts on administration at the time. And they came up with a fairly simple model. The agencies do a lot of things. It's very complicated, but we're going to see if we can set a few basic patterns. They'll do things informally. We're not going to tell you anything about that because there's nothing to say. They'll do things that look a lot like what courts do, and we'll give you some pretty clear guidelines about that and about how they ought to go about it. And we'll have some different ways they can get exceptions from it where it simply is not really quite court-like, where it's a little more policy-driven than that. And then there are types of policy-making or decisions that look more like what Congress does, and we're going to give you a little bit of guidance about how they do that. We're not going to say a whole lot. We're going to say they ought to tell you in advance what they're going to do. They ought to provide an opportunity for people to come in and tell them why it's not a good idea to do it that way, how they could improve it, what could be better about it. They ought to respond to what people are saying in a reasonable manner, give some real, thoughtful feedback, but they don't have to say a great deal about it. And then they ought to make clear what it is they're doing. They ought to publish the rule. They ought to make it available so people know what it is. And this is all fairly straightforward stuff. It's stuff that ought to make decision-making better and make it easier for people to comply with it. So what went wrong? Well, part of what went wrong is that you can't take politics out of government. And there is, as has been described by several people already, a demand for different rules. I think Richard may have been the one who mentioned that we have now in the Code of Federal Regulations 226 volumes with more than 160,000 pages. The 10 Commandments. You know, you've got 10 little... People can remember the 10... Well, not every president, but most people can remember the 10 Commandments. It's fairly simple. It's fairly intuitive. As you go about leading your life every day, you can keep in mind what you're supposed to do. If you're in business, if you are subject to the federal regulations, I defy anyone, even the amazing Kreskin, to be able to keep in mind all of those 163,000 pages of regulations, or even just the ones that are relevant to your particular business. Not only that, they are written in ways that are designed to defy anyone who is a natural speaker of English. Now, my wife, who is also my law partner, actually has a background in tax law, so she understands this stuff. I pick up the tax code. It looks to me like it's written from the middle out in every direction, in every provision. These are not things that are designed to make life easy, and they're not designed to make our businesses more competitive. When you have rules that are difficult to understand, when you have many of them, when they intersect and overlap and contradict one another, there is no way you can run your business in a sane, thoughtful, and easy manner. And when people talk about competitiveness, think of it like running a race. If you're running a race, it's a lot easier to run the race if you're not carrying somebody on your back. And the bigger and heavier that person gets, the harder it is to run the race. When the person is, metaphorically, 226 volumes at 160-some thousand pages that are written in ways that are indecipherable, you really have an enormous weight to carry as you are trying to be competitive. In my old life, I dealt with international trade. International trade is a spur. It's a stick to make people more competitive. It's a wonderful thing to have trade as a way of measuring how competitive you are and of giving you an incentive to be more competitive. And when you find that trade is making you more competitive, what's the natural response? Stop it, so you don't have to be more competitive. Well, we have to find a way not to stop trade, not to stop what it is we're competing with, but to stop adding to the weight of the people who are on our back. How do we go about that? Well, one of the ways we do that is we look at our regulatory framework and we say, this isn't working, so let's fix it. And how are we going to fix it? Well, the first instinct is to fix it by adding more regulation. I mentioned the Administrative Procedure Act, which was passed in 1946. Since then, we have fixed regulation repeatedly. We added the Freedom of Information Act in 1967, the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969, the Federal Advisory Committee Act in 1972, the Government and the Sunshine Act in 1976, the Regulatory Flexibility Act in 1980, the Administrative Dispute Resolution Act in 1990, the Regulatory Negotiation Act in 1990, the Unfunded Mandate Reform Act in 95, the Congressional Review Act in 96, and each one of these layers on new things for agencies to do when they set about the business of regulating. We have recently a new executive order from President Obama, and it's an executive order it is hard to take issue with in the sense that it does what presidents have periodically done over the last 30 years. It says, stop. Look at the impact of what you're doing. Consider the impact of these regulations on the business community. I want people to engage in decision-making, says the executive order, that makes clear what the net benefit is to each regulation. And I want regulations that only are passed if they provide net benefits. That's hard to argue with that. However, what it also says is take account of the following factors. And among the factors you're supposed to take account of are not only ordinary costs and benefits that can be quantified, but also impacts that are hard to quantify, including equity, human dignity, fairness, and distributive impacts. Now, certainly, the President is right. These are all important considerations. And these are all things that have an impact on our society. But if you tell me too many things to keep in mind and too many things to consider, it's a little bit hard for me to make a conclusion. If we're trying to line up a crowd in front of a theater and we say, how should we line up? Well, we could line up in alphabetical order. We could line up by height. We could line up by age. We could line up in the order in which we arrive. But if you tell me, I'd like you to find a way of lining people up that takes account of people's height, age, weight, the order in which they arrive, their age, hair color, and ethnic background, it's hard to come up with a rule that does all that makes any sense to anyone. At a certain point, we have to stop adding new commands on what people should consider and realize that the only way that we're going to get a set of regulations that works, that pares down what we do, and that is understandable to the people who have to live with them, is to have some sense that we can reduce our ambition on what we're regulating, reduce our willingness to do this by laying on more commands on how to go about it, and to have a sense of modesty in what our project is. And for that, I think most people in government would say, can you wait a second?
Good for you. Good man.
We're going to take a few questions for the panel, and if you'll just announce who you are, raise your hand up here and take the microphone, and please keep your questions brief.
Hi, my name's Ben Lesser. Thank you for being here. This is really educational for me. I noticed that no one's made the point that the executive order, in my understanding, excludes independent agencies like the one in which I work, which is the second most prolific generator of regs. I just wanted to make that point. Moving on to my question, what do you think of the idea that somebody from one of the think tanks published a couple of weeks ago that we force agencies, and I guess departments for that matter, that engage now in informal rulemaking to engage in formal rulemaking, which would require, as I understand it, a lot more hearings and transparency and process, and slow the regulatory process down?
Got a thought on that? Ron?
Well, I think that more process and slower process are not always good things. I think you really have to look at this in a context in which there are so many things agencies do. Sometimes we really want them to act very quickly. Sometimes we want them to act with great deliberation. Sometimes we want them to take account of an awful lot of science, a lot of what is done at the FDA. We really want neutral science to govern. And sometimes we really want policy decisions. You know, what the FCC does is mainly policy-driven, and we just want the policy to be very good. I do want to take 1 second here to make a plug. Among federal agencies, if you're an important federal agency, you get a big budget, a lot of oversight, and you produce a lot of rules. The Administrative Conference is a small agency that gets very little money, but that actually spends its time looking at how other agencies work and trying to figure out how to make them work better. And so the more we have agencies like that that are taking the process side seriously and trying to improve it, the better off we'll be. I think broader generic fixes are unlikely to work.
Bruce.
Hi, I also work for an independent agency, although the views expressed are my own. I had a question for Jerry, and I was happy to hear that the project that Richard described to me last year of scoring our regulations is moving forward, and we look forward next year in February, right after the Oscars and the Emmys, that maybe you'll be thinking of actually giving an award for the highest scoring reg. One part of your scoring I wanted to pursue a little bit, which is the how seriously or how meaningfully the agency uses the economic or regulatory analysis in its rulemaking. Sounds to me like you're just as a first approximation, taking the agency's word for it in what they say on the face of the reg. Strikes me that although that's probably the best you can do right now, it's an approximation that could be full of false positives and false negatives. You might expect somebody who is ignoring the regulation to have a boilerplate statement that simply says, of course we took the we took this very much seriously and into account, and our final rule reflects this analysis, whereas an agency for whom cost-benefit analysis, economic analysis is in fact deeply embedded in every aspect of the rule, and from the front part of the rule and throughout the process, the economists are there, the cost-benefit people are there weighing alternatives. It might be so taken for granted they wouldn't even mention it.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you when we sit down to discuss scoring on those questions where we go through the Federal Register notice looking for evidence that the agency used the regulations, those are the ones that are the hardest for us to figure out. Now we can get some notion of whether the agency did it, more thoroughly or less thoroughly. How strongly did the agency make the claim? If it's just a boilerplate, that usually kind of sticks out. So I guess the answer is I know exactly what you mean about it being difficult. There's going to be a certain amount, maybe more error around our evaluation in those than some of the other questions. On the other hand, when Congress writes a law that tells an agency that it must consider efficiency when it issues the regulations, Department of Energy does this with its energy efficiency regulations, where they have to consider not efficiency, but they have to consider energy savings, but also costs to the businesses and so forth. They at least make an effort at saying, okay, this piece of the analysis deals with this factor Congress told us to consider. This piece of the analysis deals with this factor Congress told us to consider, and here's how we made the decision. And while it's true that you have to take some of those things with a grain of salt, when we're comparing that to other regulations where there's maybe a regulatory impact analysis, no reference to it whatsoever in the Federal Register notice, I'm willing to make a judgment about who did that better and who did that worse.
Rick?
Thank you. Rick Belzer, Regulatory Checkbook. I have a question back to the Obama executive order. There was something in it that, when I read it, I missed it. I think a lot of others may have missed it. And in Cass Sunstein's implementation memorandum from a week or so later, there was an elaboration of what might be the most radical process change ever. I can read briefly from the memo. It's about open exchange. As an open exchange refers to a process in which the views and information provided by participants are made public to the extent feasible and before decisions are actually made. Section 2 thus seeks to increase participation in the regulatory process by allowing interested parties the opportunity to react to and benefit from the comments, arguments, and information of others during the rulemaking process itself. And nowhere in the executive order did that come out, but in the implementation memorandum that's there, which is closer to, I think, Susan's wiki proposal. But this is really quite a remarkable, it seems to me a remarkable proposed process change. I'd like to get some reaction to the idea of opening up the comment process so that all of that occurs in a very public way, not under the control of an agency.
I think it does speak to the age we're living in, of course, and the wiki approach certainly seems interesting to me. In years past, it was considered that there were underrepresented groups and organizations, many who are not organized. And in years past, there have been some funding that would come to agencies so that you could help to provide access for those groups in a regulatory proceeding. But this opens it up. I just hope that as it opens up and we do get ideas and new information, that there's a mechanism, a process by which that information does become captured in some way in the decision-making process. In other words, and you didn't suggest this, but it's obviously not an end in itself to say, isn't the world wonderful, because now we're all sitting around the campfire singing kumbaya to each other about a proposed rule, and don't you feel better because you had a chance to sing? What's important is what happens as a result of the content, of course.
Okay, we're going to stop here. You'll get another chance to ask questions during lunch on your cards. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to go to the next panel. So see you in 10 minutes.